感谢您的配合。首先，各位嘉宾，我们邀请到本场讲座的主持人长丰基金会江宜桦董事长上台。各位女士、各位先生，大家好！非常欢迎，并且非常感谢各位莅临参加长丰文教基金会所举办的第一场长丰讲座。那我因为事前有跟福山先生讨论过，今天的活动因为有同步翻译，所以在这个介绍的部分就容许我用中文来说明。那大致的内容我已经也跟他沟通过。我主要就是介绍我们基金会的宗旨，以及今天这一场讲座的意义。那等一下在我介绍完之后，福山教授就会开始用英文来进行演讲。长丰文教基金会是一个新成立的基金会，是在今年初才开始运作办活动。我们基金会的宗旨大概主要就是2项，一方面我们希望能够提升台湾的公民文化素养。另外一方面，我们希望能够帮助台湾的年轻人连结国际。那么在这2个目标之下，我们基金会今年第1年所要办的一些活动，就包括像今天各位所参加的这一种大型的讲座，还有我们已经办过一场青年的座谈。那讲座跟座谈都是对社会大众开放的。那除了这个之外，我们也开始去想办法找寻台湾比较希望能够拓展视野的年轻人，让他们有机会到一些重要的国家，不管是西方或者是东南亚，去进行深度的交流，跟当地的一些其他的年轻人的团体，还有当地的一些政治、经济、社会、文化方面的领袖进行交流。那么所以呢，今天我们所办的这一场活动，就是我刚刚所讲的其中的讲座。我们的讲座的目的就是邀请一些能够带给我们不同的视野跟想法的重要的思想家、政治家，或者是企业家、社会工作者，来跟大家分享他们的一些经验。那么在今天的讲座，我们非常荣幸，也是我们的第一场讲座，能够邀请到史丹佛大学法兰西斯·福山教授。法兰西斯·福山教授他是早年毕业于康奈尔大学的古典学系，然后后来是哈佛大学的政治学的博士。那么在他毕业之后，曾经任职于好一些不同的单位，像美国的智库、兰德公司，还有像几个学校单位，譬如说 George Mason University、John Hopkins University 等等。那么最后他来到史丹佛任教。在史丹佛呢，它是属于有一个研究中心，叫做 Freeman Spogli Institute for International Study， 这是史丹佛最大的一个国际政治、国际关系的一个研究院。那在这个研究院，福山教授是担任资深研究员的工作，但他同时也是这个研究院下面有一个中心，叫做民主、发展与法治研究中心。那它的名字很长，叫做 Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law。我们常常在斯坦福的时候都把它简称为 CDDRL。那我因为去年在斯坦福曾经以访问学人的身份进修1年，所以有幸参加过这个中心的很多活动，也认识了福山教授。那么我们非常高兴能够邀请福山教授来到台湾，跟我们做他知识以及经验的分享。因为各位都知道，福山教授是享誉全世界的一个大师级的政治理论大师。他在很早的时候就因为发表了一篇论文，那一篇论文题目叫做《历史的终结》，而引起了极为激烈的讨论。后来这一小篇文章进一步发展成一本书，那本书台湾也有翻译，叫做《历史的终结与最后一人》（The End of History and the Last Man）。这一本书呢，到目前为止被全世界各地翻成的不同语文版本，大概已经超过20种之多。那这本书，我想在座很多的观众可能都是因为认识这本书而知道福山教授的大名。他在书里面主张说， 人类的历史的一个发展，也许就会是我们已经看到的代议民主，再加上市场的资本主义市场经济。可是，在这本书发表之后，其实福山教授陆陆续续又写了许多的书，在那一些陆续所写就的书里面，他慢慢对最早的那一本书的观点，已经不断的在做修正。他开始注意到文化的层面，开始注意到历史的层面，开始注意到不同的国家民族、不同的地区，有他们在发展他们的政治经济制度时候不同的摸索道路。那这里面我就不一一细数，但是跟各位大概做一个交代。包括1995年他写了一本《信任》，台湾也有翻，谈的是所谓的社会美德对一个国家的重要性。1999年他出版了一本《跨越断层》，谈的是人性跟社会治理的问题。2000年他出版了一本《后人类未来》，今天我们常常用的一个词 “post-human” 的 future。那么他那一本书谈的就是基因工程这个新的科技技术对于人类的未来可能会造成什么样一个巨大的转变。2004年，他开始把注意力转回到他原始的一个关切，那就是 state building， 所以出版了一本《强国论》，我们中文把它翻成《强国论》，谈的是21世纪全球各地的这个政府治理的问题。2006年，他针对美国的新保守主义写了一本书，书名翻译成《在十字路口的美国》。但是我要跟各位介绍的是接下来这2本最近也是最重要的书，就是分别在2011年出版的《政治秩序的根源》（The Origins of Political Order）， 以及2014年他那时候已经预告会写的下册。这本书出版的时候，书名是《政治秩序与政治衰败》。这本书跟前一本书合起来，可以说是福山教授到目前为止在政治理论建构上面最令人敬佩的2本巨著。因为最后这2本书不只是跨越了各种人文、社会跟自然学科的知识，并且它的历史纵深跟所关怀的不同文明之广，大概在我们最近这几十年来的政治学界里面，少有人能出其右。可能也因为这些成就，所以福山教授在2015年的时候获得了一个非常重要的奖项，叫做 Johann Skytte Prize in Political Science。国内知道的人可能不多，但是练政治学的人大概都知道，这个奖项从1995年设立以后，就被推崇为是政治学界的诺贝尔奖。因为政治学界不像经济学有自己的诺贝尔奖项，但是最高的奖项、最高的荣誉，就是能够获得这一个荣誉的人，包括可能在座很多人知道的美国耶鲁大学的政治学教授 Robert Dahl， 他是第一个获得这个奖项的人 ，Juan Linz 是第2个。那其后像哈佛大学的 Ted Skocpol， 或者是伯克莱大学的 Hannah Pitkin、UCLA 的 Carl Peterman， 这一些可以说是20世纪引领风骚的最重要的政治理论家，都获得过这个奖项。福山教授在2015年拿到了这个奖项的肯定，我们觉得他是实至名归。今天福山教授要跟我们分享的这个题目呢，我们在过去邀请跟沟通的过程里面，大家有交换过意见。大家可以看到，我们总的题目是从历史的终结到民主的崩坏，但是包含2场活动。一场是今天下午的这一场演讲，叫做自由主义国际秩序的崩解，但是加个问号。也就是说，到底以自由主义为基础所建构起来，大家所熟悉的这一个政治经济跟国际体系，是不是会随着最近这几年某一种右翼的民粹主义的兴起，在福山教授的用语里面叫做民粹国族主义的蔓延，而受到了终极的挑战。那么在今天的演讲之后，明天我们还会有一场座谈，题目叫做中美之间的争锋及其全球影响，是会由福山教授跟中研院朱云汉院士来进行对谈。我们非常高兴能够请福山教授来跟我们分享他对于当前民粹主义泛滥情形的忧虑。 从他最后那2本书所关切的重点，已经可以看得出来，福山教授认为一个国家的政治治理要上轨道，必须有几个很重要的因素，不是只有民主的定期选举，也必须要有深厚的、广为人民所接受的法治的文化，还有就是必须要有很有效率的国家治理能力。那么在这几个方面，不管是引领风骚的美国或崛起中的中国，都仍然有所不足。那我们自己台湾的情形又如何呢？我们自己在过去这几年的民粹主义的政治风气似乎越来越普遍，就像我们在美国还有欧洲国家所看到的一样。我们心里有这个忧虑，我们也希望大家能够共同来思考，要怎么样让台湾的政治文化跟政治治理可以更上轨道。我们邀请了福山先生来跟我们分享他走遍全球各地以及长期思考阅读所获得的一些想法，也希望能够获得大家的共鸣。等一下的进行，我们大概前1个小时由福山教授进行演讲，演讲完之后我们就开放自由提问。那因为有同步翻译的关系，各位不管用中文或用英文来提问都很欢迎。现在就让我们以热烈的掌声欢迎福山教授。Let's welcome Professor Francis Fukuyama.
So thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very grateful to former Premier Jiang and to the Fairwinds Foundation for inviting me back to Taiwan. It's been several years since I've been to this country. We have a program on Taiwan democracy in my center. We believe that Taiwan is very important for the future of democracy in Asia and in other parts of the world. And that's why we actually pay a great deal of attention to what goes on this island. So I'm really very pleased to be able to see some old friends and to catch up. I think this is also a very important time in world politics because we seem to be exiting out of one period of global history and moving into another one. And that's going to be the topic of my talk today. The end of the, it's a question. It's a question of whether we are, in fact, at the end of a period of a liberal international order, which is being threatened by the rise in many parts of the world, including in my own country, the United States, by the rise of populist nationalism. So let me begin by talking about what the liberal international order was to begin with. That liberal order was a set of rules, international rules, that were designed to promote the movement of goods, investment, people, and ideas across international borders. It had a political and an economic dimension. The economic dimension had to do with institutions like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which evolved into the World Trade Organization, also regional pacts like the European Union, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association, and others that created an interdependent world of globalized business. The political dimension of that liberal order had to do with the security arrangements between the United States primarily and a series of allies around the world, the NATO alliance with Europe, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, the treaty with the Republic of Korea, and other alliances that underpinned, in a power sense, the open world that the United States was trying to create. Now, it is very important that American power was at the base of both the economic and the political liberal order. Without American power, this world would not have come into being. It was deliberately created after 1945 by American policymakers It was in the interests of the United States, but I think it was something that could only have been put in place by the United States. There's a certain amount of game theory that suggests why this is the case. Liberal rules, international rules, are a species of public good. They will not be provided automatically by the international system unless there's a hegemonic player like the United States whose own self-interest is seen as being intertwined by the creation of these liberal rules. That hegemonic power is willing to accept free riding by other members of the system, that is to say, countries that benefit from those rules but don't contribute to their maintenance because it is in the interest of that large dominant country. And I think that was the situation of the United States. It was in the interest of the U.S. to create this order, and it could tolerate free riding by countries like Japan and Germany throughout the entire period of the Cold War because that was the interest of, it served the greater interest of the U.S. That condition is beginning to change now with the relative decline of American power and the rise of a lot of other important players in the international system. Now, the economic rationale for globalization, I think, is something that you learn in any basic international trade theory course, and I think that it remains valid. That in the aggregate, if you have a liberal set of trading rules that reduce tariffs and other barriers to trade and investment, in the aggregate, everybody will be richer. This was borne out by the actual experience of the global economy in the period since the 1970s. Between 1970 and the financial crisis in the United States in 2008, the output of the global economy quadrupled. It increased by 400%. It led to the creation of enormous new amounts of wealth around the world. But I think the other lesson that you need to draw from trade theory is that the benefits of this economic liberalization do not accrue to everybody in the society. They accrue to the society as a whole, but there are winners and there are losers. And in particular, low-skilled workers in developed countries tended to lose employment even as middle classes rose in places like China and India. The usual prescription of liberal economists for this growth of inequality is that the winners from globalization needed to compensate the losers through various kinds of protection schemes, worker retraining, job and insurance, social policies of this sort. But by and large, those policies were ineffective in stopping the kind of massive job loss that occurred in older manufacturing industries throughout the Western world, and particularly in the most liberal countries in Britain and in the United States that embraced globalization the most fully. We saw a period beginning in the 1980s with the rise of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in which the liberalization deepened because these two leaders were very vocal and articulate advocates of this liberal order, and as a result, trade barriers began to come down, the state began to shrink in many Western societies, but at the same time, a lot of the social protections that had been put in place by earlier social democratic parties began to erode. And the result was, I think, a large degree of inequality. You're probably aware of a lot of the statistics from countries like the United States where the top 10% take home a good 80% of national income, where the top 1%, in fact, earn as much in income terms as the bottom 25%. And so all of these are results of the deepening of that liberal order over the last 2 generations. And as a result, there's been a very large backlash, a political backlash against globalization, precisely from those older working classes that were not the beneficiaries of it. Now, I'm going to turn to the politics of the United States and the way that that has played out, because the United States was one of the promoters of this system, and in a certain sense, its society felt the effects of this liberalization the most fully. So, as you're probably aware, we had a very interesting election in the United States that brought Donald Trump to power last year. Donald Trump actually lost the popular vote in the United States by about 2.8 million votes. He won the presidential election in the Electoral College for a simple reason. He lost 3 important states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He lost those 3 states for a simple reason. These were all northern industrial states that had voted very reliably for the Democratic candidate in the last several elections, going all the way back to the 1980s. Hillary Clinton was so certain that she would win these states that she did not even bother to visit Wisconsin once during the entire election. The margin of Trump's victory was only about 110,000 votes in those 3 states. So in other words, if 55,000 votes had switched from Trump to Clinton in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, then Hillary Clinton would be the President of the United States. The reason that she lost those states was because they are precisely those northern industrial old manufacturing states that had been part of the Democratic Party coalition, but had switched over to the Republican Party because of those job losses. And so there's a very, very direct link between Trump's election victory and deindustrialization. That was the core of his support. During the campaign, he appealed to working class voters with the promise that he was going to restore the manufacturing economy in the United States. Now, I don't happen to believe that he's capable of doing that. I think that a lot of those voters are going to be very disappointed in his ability to actually bring their jobs back, but that was clearly something that was critical in his election success. I want to just tell you a little bit about the social background to this, because I think many Americans themselves, people from my class, meaning well-educated, people with good professional incomes, I think do not adequately represent, or they do not adequately understand the degree of social devastation that has occurred in these working class communities in the United States. There is, for example, a drug epidemic going on in these areas that has to do with heroin and opioid addiction. There's an amazing statistic that in the year 2015, about 650,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. In the past decade, male life expectancy in the United States has actually dropped. This is unprecedented. Every other developed country has seen increases in life expectancy over that same period, but in the United States, male life expectancy dropped, and it is almost entirely a result of drugs that are being taken by Americans, a lot of them white working class Americans living in small towns, living in rural parts of the country, that don't have jobs, whose families are increasingly broken, whose children are growing up in single-parent families. And this is the kind of social situation that's led to a great deal of resentment against the elites in the United States, people like me, people that benefit from globalization and from the increased trade and cross-border mobility that takes place. And so these were, in a sense, the core supporters, the most passionate supporters of Donald Trump. If you look at the Brexit vote, in favor of Britain leaving the European Union that happened last summer. You see a very similar sociological profile in the people that voted to leave. They were less urban, they were less educated, and they tended to be older. So again, people that were not benefiting and in fact had lost as a result of the globalization that has happened in Britain and in Europe more broadly. Now, I think what's interesting about the sociology of the Trump vote and the Brexit vote is that this is becoming a common pattern in many other parts of the world. So, for example, you have populist nationalists that are arising in other countries. In fact, I think that Russia was one of the first where this phenomenon happened, where Vladimir Putin, who became president in 2000, has campaigned on a nationalist platform. He wants to make Russia great again. The nature of his support is very similar to that of Donald Trump or Brexit. That is to say, he's not popular among younger, better educated urban Russians that live in St. Petersburg or in Moscow. His support base is really in smaller cities, in rural areas, among less educated Russians. And there is no question that he is very popular there. If you go to Hungary, this is one of the first countries that came out of communism. We thought that this had become a secure liberal democracy, but under Viktor Orban, the prime minister, and the Fidesz party that he leads, it has been dismantling its democratic institutions. The latest effort was to basically undermine the Central European University, a university founded by George Soros, one of the best universities in Central Europe, because he does not like to have liberal critics of his administration. And again, Orban is not popular in Budapest. He's not popular among educated cosmopolitan Hungarians. He's very popular in the countryside among less educated, more rural voters. A final example of this kind of populist nationalism is President Erdogan in Turkey, who, again, is not popular in Istanbul and Ankara and among educated Turks, but has a very passionate support base among particularly lower middle class Muslims in the countryside throughout Turkey. They're going to have a very important referendum in Turkey, I believe, in the coming week, in which there's going to be a vote on whether to expand President Erdogan's powers, turn the country from a parliamentary to a presidential, almost an authoritarian democracy. And again, it falls into the same pattern in which I would say the democratic part of these democracies is attacking the rule of law part. So every modern democratic system really is a complex series of institutions that consist of three separate institutions. So one of those institutions is the state. The state is the institution that generates power and uses it to protect the community against foreign and domestic enemies. It enforces laws. It provides basic public services. So it's the power institution. Balanced against that, you have the rule of law, which are rules that constrain power, that make sure that the executive cannot simply do whatever he or she wants in terms of the use of power. And finally, the democratic part, which has to do with electoral accountability, multi-party, free and fair elections. And really what's happening in Russia, in Hungary, in Turkey, and now I would say in Britain and in the United States, is that populist politicians are using their democratic legitimacy to attack rule of law by dismantling the protections that exist for the free press, for independent institutions like central banks, for any form of opposition so that future elections will not be decided on a level playing field. The process in the United States has not gone nearly as far as it's gone in Russia or Turkey or Hungary, because I think American institutions are actually quite strong, but the instinct, I think, in terms of Trump's view of presidential power is very similar. The mentality is similar. So if you remember, one of the first things he did when he was criticized by the press when he became president was to attack the mainstream press as fake news, as being representative of a corrupt elite, of making up lies about him, which is exactly the same instinct that Putin and Erdogan and Orban and these other populist nationalists have displayed. Now, fortunately in the United States, I think we have very robust institutions. We have a very strong press that still, I think, has a great deal of legitimacy, but the pattern, unfortunately, I think is still there. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that populism is simply a matter of uneducated people who, in their ignorance, oppose the wise policies of the elites, because unfortunately that has not been the case. I think that elites in many democratic countries have in fact made a lot of mistakes in the past decade, particularly when there have been two very notable failures, the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States in 2008 and the euro crisis that began in 2010 in the Eurozone. And there's no question about it, these were elite failures based on mistakes of policy that elites believed in, that actually they believed would benefit themselves but hurt ordinary people. In the case of the American financial crisis, it was really a failure of deregulation. The banks and other powerful interest groups did not want the constraints that were the residual regulatory structures left over from the Great Depression. So in the 1980s and 1990s, they were dismantled, and as a result, big banks like Goldman Sachs and Citigroup and so forth could take enormous risks that led directly to the collapse of the financial system in 2008. The other big problem in the United States really has to do with the design of our political system. There's a spectrum of institutional types in democratic countries in which the balance between the power institution, which is the state, and then the checking institutions, which are the rule of law and democracy, can differ. And the balance in the United States has, right since the beginning of the American Republic, been very much in favor of the institutions of constraints. That is to say, we have very strong rule of law, and we have, of course, very vigorous democracy. What we don't have is a very powerful bureaucratic state, although the power of the American state grew tremendously in the course of the 20th century. We have a system in the U.S. of checks and balances. Americans, I think, are rightly proud of this system of limitations on executive power. However, the way that the system has evolved in the last generation has actually led to a tremendous amount of dysfunction in American politics. It's the combination of that check and balance political system with a couple of things that have been happening in American society. One of them is the growth of polarization. So for much of the 20th century, the two main American political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, overlapped very substantially. All of the great legislative achievements, the New Deal, the Great Society, the Reagan tax cuts, were passed by bipartisan coalitions in Congress that were made up of both Republicans and Democrats. Beginning in the 1990s, that overlap began to disappear, and it's completely gone now. So the most liberal Republican is now considerably more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. People increasingly choose where to live based on their political preferences, whether they're red or blue. You have colors in this country as well for your political parties. In the United States, people choose to marry, or they want their children to marry, much more according to whether they're a Republican or a Democrat than whether the future husband or wife is the same race or the same religion or anything else. The partisanship has become very extreme, and there's also been a growth of money in politics. There's probably been an increase of an order of magnitude in the amount of money that flows into American elections over the past generation. So you have this combination of extreme polarization, very powerful and well-organized interest groups, coinciding with a check and balance political system that spreads power out in the system very, very broadly. And the result is something that in my last book I labeled vetocracy, meaning rule by veto. The American political system makes it very easy for well-organized minorities to veto action by the entire political system, and as a result, the decision-making ability of the American system has really ground to a halt. So, for example, Congress has not passed a budget under what it calls regular order, which is a set of rules that Congress itself developed for passing budgets. It hasn't done this in about 20 years. We've had several government shutdowns. Every year there's a big crisis over whether Congress is willing to raise the debt limit, basically to pay back its creditors. And this is not good practice. This is not the way a democratic country is supposed to fulfill its most basic duty, which is to pass an annual budget. There are many other examples of this. Tax reform. The United States has a very high corporate tax rate. The nominal tax rate is about 35%, which makes it one of the highest in the OECD. This is offset by a 10,000-page tax code that gives special subsidies and exemptions to various small interests. And every tax expert, whether Republican or Democrat, agrees that they ought to lower the nominal rate of taxation and get rid of the great mass of all of those subsidies. Congress cannot do it because all of the powerful interest groups that negotiated those subsidies in the first place can veto action by the whole. So Donald Trump wants to do tax reform. He wants to carry out something like this, effort to lower the corporate tax rate. I will bet anybody in this room that it is not going to happen because of the way that our political system is organized. It's too easy for a powerful interest group to veto action by the whole. And I would say, by the way, your system in Taiwan is beginning to look, increasingly like the American system. It's a problem in quite a number of democracies. I think it's true in Japan, which requires a high degree of consensus to do anything. It's true in Italy. It's true in India in a big way. And in all of those cases, this inability of democratic political systems to make difficult decisions because of these institutional obstacles to decision-making has produced a popular demand for a strong man, somebody that will cut through all of these obstacles and get something done. And this, I think, was a background condition for the rise of Donald Trump, that Americans are very frustrated that their political system is not producing the kinds of results that they would like to see in any number of areas, and therefore they need a leader who says, like Donald Trump did at the Republican convention, I alone can fix this. All right? Now, if we turn to Europe, I think you see a number of very similar institutional failures. Now, this is not, I think, universally true of all European democracies. I think Germany, the Netherlands, most of the Scandinavian countries actually have had democratic political systems that have tackled very difficult problems like labor market reform over the past 10 or 20 years, and they've done it successfully. But the European Union, as an institution, I think, is way too weak and therefore has led to a major crisis of legitimacy for the EU as a whole. The first of these big mistakes was the euro itself, the creation of the euro. Many economists at the time the euro was created said that if you have monetary union without a fiscal union, over time this is going to lead to big imbalances and a big crisis, and that's exactly what happened in the case of Greece. That crisis has been pushed under the rug. It has not been solved. It has not been solved, and it's going to come back, to undermine the financial system in Europe over time. The second big institutional failure in Europe has to do with the Schengen system. The Schengen system is a system of free internal movement where any member of the European Union can move freely to any other member state. Now, the problem with the Schengen system is that you cannot guarantee free internal movement of people if you cannot secure the outer borders of the Schengen zone as a whole, and this the European Union has failed to do. It became evident during the Syrian migration crisis when 1 million Syrians left Syria basically and tried to get into Europe. There was no way to keep them out of Greece, which was the main entry point, and from Greece they went through Eastern Europe to Germany to Sweden to other countries in Northern Europe, and the Europeans discovered that all these people were in the EU and they actually had no way of tracking them or knowing even how many of these people were there. It produced an enormous right-wing political backlash from Europeans that felt that their countries were being swamped by Muslim immigrants. I think that fear was overstated, but it was a real one, and it was the result of a poorly designed system of border control. And again, that is an institutional failure that the Europeans have not addressed. They have not spent enough money controlling their borders. There is going to be an outflow of several tens of millions of people, not just from Syria, but from sub-Saharan Africa into the European Union that I think is politically going to be tremendously destabilizing. And so again, this is an institutional problem that has not been addressed by the elites. The final issue I would point to is the question of identity. There are many people who voted either for Brexit or for Donald Trump who are not working class, who have not lost their jobs in a manufacturing plant over the last generation, that are actually well-to-do, well-educated, and the like. And part of the reason they voted the way they did was that they see their communities filling up with people that speak a different language, that have very different customs, that do not accept, in many cases, the basic terms of citizenship in their countries. And this has produced a big reaction. Many people, myself included, are quite comfortable living in a multicultural society. I mean, look, my own family emigrated to the United States from Japan 100 years ago, and so I have a big stake in, seeing America as a multicultural society, but I think it's not surprising or unreasonable that people don't want to lose, the culture of their countries, or they don't want to see it changed in what they feel is an uncontrolled way. And so I think a lot of the de facto shift into multiculturalism has produced a nativist backlash on the part of white Europeans and white Americans saying, well, look, aren't we a minority also in our own country, and don't we have rights? And why is it that only, non-white people are privileged by the government and the beneficiaries of various social programs and so forth? Again, this is a complaint that is very much overstated by the people on the right in the United States, but it is definitely a factor that is driving this populist vote. Now, I want to turn to Asia, because Asia is not, I think, part of this trend that I just described towards populist nationalism. Asia is suffering from many of the same economic dislocations as Europe and the United States in terms of manufacturing job loss. Even China today, I think, has maxed out in terms of manufacturing employment and has been losing, because their wages are increasing, they've been losing employment to lower labor cost areas like Vietnam or Bangladesh and so forth. There's been major crises in a lot of older, heavy industries in this part of the world. Last year, the South Korean shipbuilding industry suffered a huge set of bankruptcies and setbacks. Here in Taiwan, I suspect you're all familiar with that. So the economic conditions for this kind of backlash exist in this part of the world as well. But I don't think that you've seen the same kind of rise of this right-wing, anti-immigrant, nationalistic populism here that you do in Europe or in the United States. The populism exists, but it's mostly been mobilized by traditional left-wing parties. If you look at Europe, there's a difference between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. So in Southern Europe, in Greece, in Spain, in Italy, you still have traditional left-wing parties, and displaced workers continue to vote for those left-wing parties. In Northern Europe, you get right-wing, anti-immigrant, anti-European Union populist parties where the right mobilizes and captures the support of these less well-to-do workers. Asia as a whole is more like Southern Europe than it's like Northern Europe. So in Korea, you're probably going to see the election of a new president from the Minju Party, which is the left-wing party. Here in Taiwan, the populist party is really the DPP, and so forth. In China, you actually have a kind of populism under Xi Jinping. He has been undertaking a massive anti-corruption campaign which is aimed at the existing elites in the Communist Party. He's very popular among ordinary Chinese who don't like all of these corrupt officials, and Xi has been able to capitalize on that resentment of those party elites. But again, this is not the same thing as Donald Trump, because it's not a grassroots movement, and it's not really something that comes from the bottom upwards. It's really something that's driven by the elites and is being used by the elites to bolster their own position. I think something similar has been going on in Asia. There's plenty of nationalism in Asia. In fact, one of the most disturbing things is watching Japan, Korea, and China in the last 10 or 15 years actually teach their young people to be more nationalistic than the previous generation. But again, this is not a grassroots movement so much as something I think that's been deliberately manipulated by the elites in those countries to bolster their own legitimacy. And it's really quite different, I think, from the sort of uprising of right-wing nationalism. But the final and most important difference, I think, between Asia and Europe or the United States is immigration. That there simply hasn't been the same level of immigration in this part of the world as there has been in those other developed regions. And there are not as many Muslims, quite frankly, because I think the challenge to many countries in Europe has been the cultural difference that's represented by specifically Muslim immigrants compared to, let's say, Hispanic immigrants coming into the United States. And where there has been Muslim immigration, as in Myanmar, you are getting a big nativist reaction from the Burmese Buddhist community. So that, I think, explains why Asia is different. By the way, I don't think that Asians should sit back and be self-satisfied about their reluctance to take immigrants, because you may have noticed that almost every country in Asia, including your own, is suffering from an incredible demographic crisis because of low birth rates. One of the big advantages, I think, that the United States has is because of our high rate of immigration, our population is actually still expanding, and we are going to get economic growth from population growth, into, I mean, it's going to end eventually, but it's going to continue for some time whereas this part of the world is facing a kind of unprecedented decline in working populations. We can discuss in the question and answer period why that's the case, but I'll leave that for later. So to conclude, when we think about the future of the liberal international order, it's clear that there are really big threats. Liberalism has been under attack domestically and internationally from many different sources. Some of them are overtly authoritarian, like the Chinese government, that never pretended to be particularly liberal and wants to promote its own form of authoritarianism, or Vladimir Putin's version of Russian authoritarianism. But the more important threats are coming from within liberal democracies themselves, from liberal democracies that are not happy with globalization, which are becoming more intolerant, are becoming more nationalistic, and are threatening to dismantle those very liberal institutions that they created in the period after World War II. Now, I don't want to make a lot of firm predictions. I would say now that we're about 70 days into the Trump presidency, I actually am a little bit relieved because he's reversed himself on a lot of the really, I think, absurd things he said when he was a candidate. So he's not going to label China as a currency manipulator. He's going to keep Janet Yellen on as the head of the Federal Reserve. He thinks that NATO is actually worth something and not an obsolete institution. You know, it doesn't look like he's going to launch a trade war with China anytime soon, so he may end up being a more conventional politician. However, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a great deal of damage done in the process of his evolution as a politician, and that comes in several respects. First of all, he's triggered responses in other countries. So there are a lot of mini Donald Trumps arising in different parts of the world that are using his populist techniques to get votes and, you know, win political power for themselves. In foreign policy, I think this is an area of tremendous danger because you have an extremely inexperienced and unknowledgeable president who has put together an administration that is not well staffed. The senior people, like the Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, are all competent people, but they have very little support underneath them, and they also express opinions that are at variance with those of the president. And so it's very difficult to really understand what actual American policy is. I would say that in international affairs, credibility is really the coin of the realm for both friends and enemies. People have to know that if you say, we're not going to let North Korea get a nuclear weapon, I think both the North Koreans and everybody else, the Japanese and everybody else in the region, has got to know whether you mean that seriously or not, and whether you're going to take real measures, you know, to stop them. And from this administration, it's very, very difficult to know what it is they really mean or how they plan to carry out some of the things that they have apparently promised. I think in other respects, there's a more subtle kind of threat going on in the world. I've been arguing for some time that one of the big dividing lines in the world now is less between democracies and authoritarian regimes than it is between modern impersonal countries and ones that are highly corrupt. In a certain sense, you know, the problem with Putin's Russia is not that it's not democratic. I have no doubt that if there was an election, a free and fair election in Russia tomorrow, that Putin would be reelected as president because he does seem to be extremely popular. What Russia represents is not a failure of democracy, it's really a failure of a modern state. because he's running a kleptocracy, meaning the regime is a group of insiders who exploit their political position for their own self-enrichment. There's a very amusing film that you can watch on YouTube by Alexei Navalny, this anti-corruption campaigner, about Prime Minister Medvedev. Go ahead and Google it on YouTube. It's already gotten like 20 million views. It's one of the reasons that there are all these anti-corruption demonstrations by young Russians a couple of weeks ago in 99 Russian cities. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable the amount of wealth that has been sucked out of the system by the elites in that system. And I think that that is one of the, the biggest issues, is this decline in the quality of government as a result of just gross political corruption. And unfortunately, that's, I think, one of the precedents that our current president in the United States is setting in terms of his personal wealth and his unwillingness to disengage his personal family interests from that of his position as a public official. The final issue I will leave you with is the question of technological change. In Silicon Valley, where I live, it's very common to see self-driving cars out on the street. And in the United States, there are about 3.5 million truck drivers and probably a comparable number of taxi and limousine drivers. And then there are all the people that depend on those drivers for their livelihoods, people that run restaurants and truck stops and gas stations and so forth. So we are going to have self-driving cars much sooner than anyone realizes. The technology, I'm told by people in that industry, is actually already there. The main problem is getting the regulators and consumers to recognize that these are actually safer than human drivers. So what's going to happen to the livelihoods of all of those people who drive vehicles for a living once self-driving cars become ubiquitous? What are they going to do? What other forms of employment are they going to find? I think that that technological challenge is the thing that is going to confront every politician in every country as we go forward. And unfortunately, I have not heard very good solutions being put forward by policy experts on how to solve this problem. The usual answer given by economists is retraining. You have to educate people, push them into higher skill categories, and obviously that's something that every country needs to do. But there's a limit to how many jobs you can create. You cannot take a 55-year-old truck driver and retrain them as a computer programmer, a graphics designer, or a political commentator or whatever. It's simply, I think, beyond the capacity of our educational systems. And as long as that's the case, I think a lot of the economic discontent that's driving this surge of populism is going to be a factor in all of our countries. And that, I think, is kind of the central challenge that we are all going to have to confront if we are going to maintain this liberal international order that I think overall has been of great benefit to all of us. So with that, I'll stop talking, and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I want to thank Professor Francis Fukuyama very much for his terrific and very inspiring lecture, which covers not only North America, but also Europe and some other places, including the East Asia. I think what we are going to do in the following 55 minutes is to open the floor to take questions. As my colleagues is changing the chairs, what I would like to let you know is, if you want to ask question, please just raise your hand and I will identify your place. Then I think we all have a microphone on the side of your chair. So maybe what you need to do is to turn on and speak. And you can speak in either English or Chinese because, as I said, we have simultaneous interpretation. And I also would like you to identify yourself. If you do not want to say your full name, at least let us know your surname or your professions. Then please limit your question as possible as within 2 minutes so that we can take as many questions as possible. Now, I think we are ready. Please be seated. I think we need another microphone for Professor Fukuyama. Thank you. Okay, now the floor is open. I think Professor Fukuyama is ready to take any questions. Okay, please, Professor Wu.
Yeah, I'm Yushan Wu from Academia Sinica. My question is, do you think this crisis of the fall of the international order, is that an unprecedented event or that it actually has happened in history? The reason I'm asking this is because Barry Buzan, a very famous international relations scholar, he mentioned in a keynote speech in Taipei that what we are witnessing is a completely unprecedented unfolding of history, that we are entering a post-liberal international order. Now my question is, it seems to me that what we are seeing today is quite similar to what the world looked like in the 1920s. Namely, we had a major economic crisis followed by worsening dispersion of income, and a lot of people are suffering from their economic starvation, etc. And then the right-wing political leaders, parties, and regimes are somehow providing an outlet for popular anger towards the outsiders, so that you have the rise of those right-wing authoritarian forces leading finally to a world war. So what we're seeing is actually a 2007-2008 economic crisis followed by an economic situation that is really pretty bad, and then the political backlash that seems to be providing those right-wing politicians and regimes a wonderful opportunity to unleash popular anger against the foreigners. So do you think what we are seeing today is a repeat of history or something that is completely unique?
Well, I agree that this is, it's not unprecedented. In the 1920s, you had both a left-wing populism in the form of all of the communist parties that were organizing all over the world in industrializing countries, and then you have the right-wing nationalist parties as well. The fact that there's a precedent for it is not very comforting because, of course, what happened in the 1920s is that either the left-wing or the right-wing populist parties came to power in Germany and Italy and Russia and so forth, and then started a Second World War. So I think that, it shows the dangers. And there, I think, I'm actually not that pessimistic because I don't think that we're in a situation where you're likely to get actual conflict between, any of these groups. What you could get, I think, is more what happened in the 30s in the economy, which is a deterioration of the liberal order and therefore economic protectionism that sets off trade wars and declining output on the part of people. Now, down the road, that may lead to more extreme political outcomes, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that. So yes, there was a precedent, and it's not a good one.
Okay, there, please. I think we may need the microphone if your microphone is not working.
Thank you. My question, this is John Chen. I am a, let's say, learning facilitator in the university. Okay, my question will be that it appears that it's a devastating populism you're talking about. It happened in Taiwan exactly. In 2 years ago, there is Taipei Spring. We call it Sunflower Movement. Actually, it toppled the government, and our former prime minister becomes a visiting scholar in Stanford. So actually, in those days, it really is, actually, it's exactly what you mentioned. There's a non-exclusive growth, and the young people revolted. So now, at the end of it, we don't have FTA with China, which means we're isolated from the rest of the world. There are only 2 countries in this part of the region which is isolated from any of trade agreements, North Korea and Taiwan. We are the second one. So the question is, how do you reverse this devastating populism? Thank you.
Well, so I think you're right that there was populism. What I was trying to argue was that this is actually a more familiar kind of left-wing populism, and that in Asia, most of the populist movements have been left-wing. What you have not seen, so the Sunflower Movement, well, I guess it was a national identity movement in many respects, but it was not an intolerant, kind of aggressive nationalism of the sort that you see in Europe, in places like the National Front in France or, some of these other right-wing parties. The left-wing movements, maintain an important component of liberalism because they actually want to maintain open societies. They're not going to attack the media. They're not going to try to create authoritarian political structures. And in general, the reason I don't think it's that devastating is that Taiwan is a pretty good democracy. So you have popular mobilization. It's true that it led to the downfall of a government, but then you have an election and you get a new government, and that's the way a democratic system is supposed to work. And so it's not, there are many definitions of populism, but I think that the ones that apply the most to the new movements that we're seeing have to do with a couple of features. So one is a pervasive anti-elitism, that blames the entire system. I don't think the Sunflower Movement wanted to destroy Taiwan's democratic system. They simply wanted to change the administration. And the other thing about populist movements is a cult of personality. That most of these movements are led by individuals who, like Donald Trump, say, I alone can solve this problem. And again, that movement didn't really have that kind of leadership. So I think it still is, not, I wouldn't put it in the same category as what's been going on in other parts of the world.
Thank you. Here, please, the young gentleman.
福大先生你好，我是陈建宇。我想问一个问题是说，在您刚提到就是说这一波的所谓民粹主义这个起来哦，但是有一个部分是谈到就是说，比如像在 Brexit 这部分，有些英国人会认为说有太多的被布鲁塞尔这些精英所控制，而无法反映出他们真实的反应。但是另一方面， 自由主义，因为我们提到国际秩序，在国际秩序建立底下，我们强调我们必须要去所谓遇到一些危机的时候，国际社会必须要适时的做出一些措施。但是这几年在譬如说叙利亚的危机里面，我们没有看到任何国际的作为，因为一直在强调所谓的合法性的问题。所以，同时这两个面向里面，我们到底要如何改进我们现有所看到的国际秩序？谢谢。
So that's, I think, a really key question, and I think that one of the things that has to happen is the elites themselves have to understand that they have to fix some of the basic problems that they created that are driving the populism. So, for example, in Europe, I think they need to solve this question of the external borders, which in practical terms means that the Germans have to basically provide the money and the resources to Greece and Italy to help them secure that southern border. They're not doing that right now. The Germans have really not stepped up to it. I actually think the Germans also have to ease up on their demand for austerity on the part of the Greeks, because there's just no way that Greece is ever going to repay the debt that it has. In the United States, I think that actually we have a lot of illegal immigration. So there's a certain, Donald Trump is right that we don't do very much to enforce our existing laws. I think we can enforce them in a different way than he's choosing to do it through employer sanctions, but that's something that the American political system has not really stepped up to yet. So I think there are many specific policy changes that will correct some of the underlying problems that are driving the populism. However, as I said at the end of the talk, since so many of the job losses are being created by technological advance, I don't know that you can fundamentally ease the threat, the economic threat that technology is posing, which is why I think you're going to have this populism problem, for some time.
Yeah, the lady over there, just beneath the video camera.
Professor Fukuyama, you mentioned a few times about multiculturalism. With some experts predicting that WASP is going to represent a minority in the States. So coming back to multiculturalism, with the States being the largest lab on Earth, what do you think the future impact would be? And the second question is the self-driving car. I'm surprised to hear that the U.S. government hasn't done anything yet. It sounds scary. Thank you.
I mean, the government should stop it.
So the question of multiculturalism is very complicated. I'm actually writing a book on this subject now, so maybe you should invite me back to Taiwan in about a year to talk about this. Every society has to have a common culture, meaning that there have to be these unwritten rules by which people communicate and cooperate and believe in a common legitimacy of their social system. But that does not have to be linked to a specific ethnic group or race or religion. And so I think the task for a modern democratic society is to create a common set of rules, cultural rules, that will permit de facto diversity in their citizens. Now, I actually think that the United States does a pretty good job at this. It's pretty good at assimilating people that are not white European, descendants of white Europeans into its society. making them feel like they're full Americans and making use of their talents and so forth. Silicon Valley is a great case of this. There are forms of multiculturalism that are very destructive, that where you really cannot run a society. So, for example, the worry in Europe now is that you've got these extremist Muslim communities that really do not accept the basic cultural tenets of a liberal society, particularly with regard to women. They don't accept, female equality, and therefore will never really become fully assimilated into the cultural norms of that society. And that's a very serious problem where I don't think you can, whether you can actually assimilate that kind of population, I think is one of the big challenges that Europe is facing right now. So you need some degree of cultural uniformity, but it has to be one that accommodates the de facto diversity of actual modern countries. On the self-driving cars issue, the only solution really that the U.S. government could take other than regulating it and making sure it's safe, which is what they're doing now, is to try to ban it. But they're not going to do that. How can you ban self-driving cars? And as a result, you're really not going to stop the threat to low-skilled jobs that the self-driving car represents. Even if a politician wanted to ban a self-driving car, I don't see how they're going to do it, because the technology is going to be developed in one place or another. If not in the United States, then in China or Japan or maybe here in Taiwan, and it's going to go ahead, I think regardless. So that's what makes the problem a really difficult one, because I don't think you can ultimately put the brakes on this kind of technology.
Okay, the young gentleman over there, and then you will be next. Thank you.
福山教授您好，我曾拜读过您《卸任》这本书。您在书中提到，相对于德国及日本，美国的一个缺点是它有浓厚的诉讼文化，大量的社会资源被不必要的官司消耗掉。那您是否认为，在建立一个国家完善的法治机制时候，我们可以规避掉昂贵的司法成本？
Yes, you can. So the ability to sue the government, I think, is actually an important part of the rule of law. So all we're talking about is how easy is it, and for how many conditions, and who has the standing to do it. In my state of California, we have about 40 million residents. Any one of us can sue any infrastructure project for any reason. It's completely crazy. It's done under an environmental law, but you don't have to have an environmental reason in your lawsuit. So somebody's building, a highway overpass that's blocking your view of some nice, scenery, and you can sue the government to stop that from being built. And this is crazy, I think. And it's something that you could fix. All you have to do is change the law of standing about who has the right to launch a lawsuit and restrict it to people that are doing it for an environmental purpose. They have to be an established environmental group. There has to be a statute of limitations on when you can launch the suit, so on and so forth. Other democratic countries do not have they don't make it as easy to sue as the United States does. India is even worse. India, the Supreme Court in India has a backlog of about 60,000 cases that they've not heard. In India, in general, you don't even have to sue. I mean, the court system is so backlogged that the threat of a suit is usually sufficient to get the other party to negotiate with you and, make whatever concession is necessary to avoid having to go into this awful court system. So judicial reform in that sense to make these legal systems more efficient and to reduce the recourse to litigation, I think is is something that my country can certainly use.
There must be something done in some other countries too. Okay, I just mentioned that the gentleman in break. It's your turn, please.
福山教授你好，我想请教你一个问题，是这样的，刚刚您有所提到是说，在科技的演变当中，像现在的全球互联网络的一个高速发展，在每一个社会运动当中都有互联网当中扮演一个非常重要的作用，像是台湾的太阳花学运，然后像香港的雨伞革命，再到像前一段时间南韩的朴槿惠下台的民众示威当中。互联网在当中都扮演一个非常重要的作用，但是互联网网络这一块领域，对于很多国家乃至于现代政治而言，它还是一个比较空白的一个区域，在一个资讯已经变得较为由原来的垂直变成平行，然后民众之间的交流也非常接近的一个状况之下，那未来政府会怎么应对这个更为自由的一个资讯，以及民意的更直接的一个反扑呢？谢谢。
That's actually a very important topic that I didn't address in my talk, but maybe I can say something about it now. When the internet started in the 1990s, everybody, myself included, were very optimistic that this would be very good for democracy because information is power, and if you give more people access to information, it's going to empower them to participate and defend their rights. And I think that that part has proven to be true. So you're right that many of these social movements have been vastly improved and helped by the existence of social media. But I think what we've seen in the last year with the Russian effort to interfere in the American election is a dark side of the internet, that the internet has removed all of the gatekeepers, fact checkers and editors and people that were responsible for guaranteeing a certain level of quality of information. And as a result, it's very easy to disseminate false information. And so we saw a lot of that going on in the American election, where conspiracy theories and just outright false factual information was being passed around, and then it would become viral, and everybody would see the same, accusations. There's this famous case where Hillary Clinton was accused of running a pedophile ring out of a restaurant in Washington, and some guy actually took an automatic weapon and went to the restaurant looking for these pedophiles and this sort of thing. So we've now got this really big problem of so-called fake news. And countries like Russia have gotten very good at using this to weaken people's belief in the legitimacy of their own governments and institutions. They did it in the United States. They're doing it now in France and in Germany and in other European democracies. We don't have a solution to this at the moment. I think that some countries like Germany can try to regulate this because there's still enough of a social consensus behind the government to do this. In the United States, that's impossible. Donald Trump is one of the biggest creators of fake news, and so he has no interest in trying to regulate it. So I think that if there's any regulation, it's going to have to be on the part of the social media companies like Twitter and Facebook, to do it, themselves. But whether they're willing to do it is another question. So I think it's a difficult policy problem, and we've only begun to address it.
Okay. Mr. Xi.
Professor Fukuyama, this is Jason Shi. I am a member of parliament and a legislator. it touched on several issues that are quite central to my work, so I've been taking notes, so thank you. I wanted to mainly ask two questions. One is regarding trade. In February, our legislative delegation made a trip to the United States, and we met with government officials in Washington, D.C. It was at a time when all the cabinet members were not filled in yet, and it seems to me that Donald Trump had just scraped the TPP, and he's looking for the new set of understanding trade and bilateralism. So people were scrambling to understand what is his mindset in terms of doing trade with other countries. And do you see Donald Trump or President Trump entering into a new framework of trade concept? If he's now looking at regional integration, what would be some of the elements that he's looking to in terms of balancing out the deficits or some of the weakness America is facing, and how would Taiwan respond to that? And my second question is, in just 1 week ago, President Trump and President Xi Jinping met for the first time, and it seems to me that when Trump was when he was first elected, there was a call between Trump and our President Tsai Ing-wen, and he has caused a lot of international media attention. And it seems to me that was a mishap on Trump's side. But how would Taiwan steer under such a big giants, when they are dancing? How would Taiwan steer herself in this maze of kind of difficult situation to deal with? And it's my two questions. Thank you.
Well, let me start with the second one. Taiwan would be very foolish to take seriously an overture like the one that Donald Trump made, suggesting that, maybe the one China policy will be discarded. I think that this was a pure tactical calculation on his part. And essentially, he was thinking to himself, well, maybe I can hold the one China policy hostage in order to get better terms from China in some future negotiation, which means that he's ready to discard Taiwan at the first instance if China offers him a better deal. So from Taiwan's standpoint, I think you'd be very foolish to put any trust in, in him. On the bigger question of what he's going to do, it doesn't look like he's going to do much, because I think that, first of all, he's surrounded himself with all of these advisors that I think understand pretty well the nature of global supply chains and how difficult it is to really undo NAFTA or WTO rules or any of these things. And so I think he's probably, my guess would be that he will try for a few symbolic victories. So, and there's some specific areas. So, for example, he's wrong that China is right now holding down its currency. They've been doing the opposite, but they did this in the past, and they've been dumping steel. One of his big advisors is the CEO of Nucor, this mini mill steel producer, and it's not just Donald Trump. I mean, almost every European country thinks that the Chinese are dumping steel on the international market. So there are specific areas where he could get very tough with China to get a very specific concession that would not involve rewriting the entire trade regime, but could actually, bring some benefits. My hope is that that's what he'll end up doing, and I think that his advisors are probably going to push him in that direction.
Okay, I would like to give priority to this area. Is there anybody? Thank you. Mr. Chen.
Thanks, Albert Chen. Thanks for the very stimulating presentation. I'm curious about two questions. First, how liberal, on what basis and to what extent can we really describe the current international system as liberal. I think that's the basis for the whole argument. And second, you talk about the major threat is the rise of the populist nationalism. But I think one major distinction should be made from the past time when nationalism dominated the political agenda. When that time we know that nation as an imagined community dominate how people identify themselves. But nowadays, to the greatest extent, what we observe is that even the rise in populist nationalism never attract the majority of a nation, any of the nation. On the contrary, it's listed. It have to compete with other forms of identities, such as diasporic identity, multicultural identity, cosmopolitanism, and so on and so forth. I think one major issue is the rise of social media, which makes the mass media. We know that the foundation for nationalism is the mass media experience, but nowadays it's imperial. Nobody really, most of the advanced democracy don't see the mass media play a very important role nowadays. So I think the role of the rise of the social media should be put into the picture of what you just described. Thanks.
Well, your last comment suggests that actually the nation state is not going to be the basic unit, that social media is going to disintegrate the nation state into, smaller groups. And to some extent, that's happened already. So in the United States, compared to when I was a child, there is much less of a sense of national purpose, of common citizenship. This is partly what I was referring to with the rise of polarization and partisanship, that, if you live in rural Alabama or Louisiana, it's like you're in a completely different country from San Francisco or New York or Chicago. And the social media actually permits even more specialized, forms of community that have a kind of atomizing, impact on what people hold in common. However, I still think that nations are going to be very important, if only because of language. That nations are held together as linguistic communities. I think that it's very hard to transcend some of those boundaries and really feel a lot in common with people with whom you don't share a common language. I think that there's still mass media, despite the rise of social media, that tends to give people living in the same country a certain common sense of identity. And I think because power resides still at a national level, I don't think that that's going to disappear quite so easily, although you are going to have these breakaway movements like Catalonia or Scotland or, these other regional kinds of groupings. With regard to the question of how liberal is our liberal order, it all depends on compared to what. It's much more liberal than the kind of system that existed in the 1930s. It's more liberal than the system that existed in the 1970s. I mean, the barriers to the movement of capital, to the average level of tariffs, all of these things have come down, very, very dramatically in that period. And for a 30-year period, world trade was growing at a substantially faster rate than global GDP, indicating that cross-border transactions were increasing, at a very rapid rate. All of that's slowed now, and so now I actually think that the rate of the growth of trade is actually equal to or even below, GDP growth. So we've obviously come to an end of that period. So, but things are without question more liberal than they were 30, 40 years ago.
Okay, I just want to take question from this area, and the gentleman, yes, you, please. Try to use the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Fukuyama, for your talk. I'm Abraham Gerber with the Taipei Times. I want to go back to the issue of vetocracy in the United States. So you maintain that vetocracy or gridlock is a major problem that undermines the legitimacy of the American political system, that increases the appeal of a potential strongman figure. And then the solution that you propose is a stronger bureaucratic state. Now my question is, how do you strengthen the state by establishing a stronger bureaucracy without making it more vulnerable to manipulation by some kind of a strongman figure? Because as soon as you start to remove some checks or constraints, theoretically, you're also potentially making the system more vulnerable to being hijacked or used in ways that can sort of further undermine liberal norms. How do you strike a right balance?
So ever since Donald Trump became President of the United States, a lot of people that were worried about gridlock and divided government are all of a sudden really in favor of checks and balances because they want to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't do anything damaging. And I think that that's, so that's obviously a real worry. And I think I'm glad that we've got checks and balances, but it really is a matter of degree. And we can actually eliminate a number of checks. So let me give you a very concrete example, which is the filibuster. For most of the 20th, it only took a bare majority in Congress to get a bill passed. For the last 15 years or so, the filibuster has come into play for routine legislation, meaning you had to have 60 votes in the Senate to get anything passed, meaning that a 40% minority was sufficient to veto any measure. And as a result, when Obama was president, there was something like 60 federal judges and another 60 ambassadors that were being held up in the Senate because they could not get confirmed. I don't think that's a good situation. They actually exercised the so-called nuclear option because the Democrats wanted to block Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court as payback to the Republicans. I think that was a terrible idea, and the Republicans then voted to get rid of the filibuster. I'm in favor of that. I think that Donald Trump ought to be, he was elected legitimately, he ought to be able to appoint, with the consent of the Senate, a Supreme Court justice, of his choosing, just like Obama should have been allowed to do the same thing. And so I think that you can reduce some of these unnecessary checks while maintaining, the biggest and most important ones: free media, independent court system. You can have an independent court system that does not allow 40 million residents of California to sue the government. I mean, that's just, there's something in between those extremes that I think would lead to better outcomes for our political system.
Now let's come back to this area. The young lady over there at the corner. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Fukuyama. This is a reporter from Commonwealth Magazine. And I'm going to ask about current events. So I'm wondering, could you comment on the recent emerging allegations that the alleged chemical attack by Assad was merely a pretext to attack Syria? And if it was the case, I'm wondering, could you comment on the possible reasons behind a false flag operation, or the reasons behind such allegations? Thank you.
I don't know. I don't put a lot of credence behind a lot of these conspiracy theories that this is all staged as an excuse to attack Syria. I think that, Assad has got a pretty bad track record, and I think it's very likely that he's responsible for that. I think Trump's response, there was a political element in it because he wanted to show he's not Obama, and he did that, pretty effectively. Whether it was in the end going to be an effective policy, I have my doubts. But I really don't think that, you had to invent, you know, this attack simply as an excuse to attack Syria?
We have many hands. The lady first.
谢谢。教授，谢谢您的演讲。我是谢敏珊，然后我是台大政治系的学生。然后我今天想要请问一下，就是比较是有关于世代认知差异的问题。因为我们知道，就是自由主义之所以会衰退，然后民族主义兴起，是因为在这个制度底下有所谓的受害者的出现。然后想请问，就是我们现在台湾年轻人或者世界各地的年轻人，可能就会面临到这种现况，就是当我们想要进去这个制度的时候，可是这个制度已经被一些就是已经被一些人就是先把好处都拿光，可能我们会认为有相对的剥夺感。然后在我们这个时代，可能有更多的社群媒体的一些就是社群媒体的一些讨论之类。那请问您认为就您的观察，就是我们这个世代认知的差异会对于未来的政府造成一些什么样的危机，或其实是这是一个政府所要就是面对的挑战，跟这其实是一个转机呢？谢谢您。
Generational gap.
Well, it's neither a threat nor an advantage, but it's a reality that every generation has a fundamental set of experiences that then shape the way that they look at reality, you know, for the rest of their lives. And I think that that can be good and it can be bad. So in the former communist world, a lot of people who grew up under communism, well, okay, actually, maybe there's a more relevant example. So, for example, and we were discussing this at lunchtime today. In China today, the generation that grew up under the Cultural Revolution, I think were so they were so, you know, tormented by that experience that they were the ones that then facilitated the opening up of China under Deng Xiaoping and the whole kind of set of liberalizing reforms, because they didn't want to have to live through the Cultural Revolution again. They didn't want to see a single leader get that much power. Now what's happening, I think, in China is you have a whole generation that's grown up after the Cultural Revolution. They didn't experience that. And in a certain sense, because they weren't taught by their parents' generation about the realities of the Cultural Revolution, they can even feel nostalgic for the days when there was more equality and you didn't have all these rich, you know, people, corruption, you know, so on and so forth. And that's a case where actually I think generational change has had a kind of negative effect, because the younger generation are more susceptible to, you know, a strongman leader, you know, doing the things that Mao Zedong did, whereas their parents' generation were kind of immunized from that because of their personal experiences. Sometimes it can be the opposite. Sometimes people will hold on to old beliefs that are really not very functional, and you have to literally wait for them to die off before you can get real social change. So I think it works in both ways, but it's absolutely the case that generational change is important. When I was writing my book on biotechnology, I'm one of the few people that actually is not in favor of life extension. I actually think that there's a good reason why, you know, in human evolution you have generational turnover, because you wouldn't have social adaptation if you didn't have generational turnover. So I'm all in favor of, you know, well, I won't go there. It gets a little...
Okay, the lady first, then the gentleman. Okay.
Thank you, Li Yuan. I'm wondering, you know, China now is the second biggest economy in the world, and it has a lot of money to buy all kinds of things around the world and give loans to many countries and make investment in the US, Europe, everywhere. And at the same time, it's an authoritarian regime and is very good at using the internet to monitor its people and all these things. And I'm wondering what kind of impact China's rise will have on the liberal international order.
So I think this is going to be the topic
of
that,
tomorrow's dialogue. So welcome to join us tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, I've stayed away from a lot of the international dimensions of this because it is going to be the topic of our talk. So I invite you to return tomorrow afternoon and we'll go into this in greater detail.
Yeah, that's true. The young gentleman over there, yeah, you are the next.
Good afternoon, Professor Fukuyama and Professor Zhang. In this speech, Professor Fukuyama, you have multiply used political dialogue in U.S. Congress and Senate as an example for U.S. Political polarization. However, I think that the design of the political system in U.S. is not the origin of the political polarization. I believe you have already mentioned some origin of the political polarization, but if you don't mind, I would like you to restate this origin again to clarify some. Maybe I misinterpreted the word. I overheard it. I do apologize for that. And you have mentioned several, and besides. Most of the solution you believe you mentioned to tackle this political polarization is mainly focused on fixing the political system. You haven't mentioned, do you believe there's any other way to fix this besides fixing the political system? Or, thank you.
Yeah, so, so let me clarify what I said. The problem is not just the political system, because we had pretty much the same checks and balances in this political system since the beginning of the United States for the last 250 years. The problem is when you combine our political system with extreme polarization and very well organized interest groups, which is something new. For most of the 20th century, neither of those conditions existed. So when you take polarization, interest groups, and a system of very extensive checks and balances, that's when you get political dysfunction. Now, the problem is that in terms of polarization, I have no idea what you do about that. You know, that's driven by the media, it's driven by technology, it's driven by the autonomous development of ideas. I have no idea why the Republican Party has been taken over by these Tea Party fanatics. I don't know what to do about it. You can't do anything about it in terms of public policy. So that part of it you can't fix. What you can fix are things like getting rid of the filibuster. That's not going to solve our problem, but it will make things a little bit easier at the margin. But I don't pretend that that's going to be a solution to the larger problem of dysfunction in the American system. That is going to have to await a kind of social transformation where Americans begin agreeing with each other, you know, to a greater extent than they do now.
One final question from this area, please. The microphone is behind you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fukuyama. My name is Kenneth Chow, and I'm a writer, okay? Because of what you said about Taiwan's believing of Donald Trump, so I changed my question from an abstract one into a real politic one. Do you have any objection to the statement that describing Mr. Trump as the president for the last 40, the U.S. president for the last 40 years, who is most likely to trade off Taiwan with China in the name of American interest? Do you have any objection to that statement?
Where comes the statement?
Well, So Donald Trump prides himself as a deal maker. So I think that that's why people think that he may be willing to contemplate that kind of a trade. I think, however, that that's where the American system is going to prevent him from doing it, because Taiwan has a lot of support in the U.S. Congress. And I think members of his own party are going to be the first people to object to some kind of a deal at Taiwan's expense. So I wouldn't worry about that.
Okay. Professor Fukuyama is not a spokesman of the White House, but I think we feel comfortable to hear that. I would like to thank on behalf of the Fair Wind Foundation again to Professor Fukuyama for your very, very extraordinary, inspiring lecture. And as we said at the beginning of our introduction, there will be another event which will be a dialogue between Professor Fukuyama and Professor Zhu Yunhan tomorrow afternoon from 2:30 to 4:40, the same place. So even if you did not register for that event, you are welcome to come, because I think we have plenty space to accommodate every audience. So would you please join me again to give Professor Fukuyama a big hand for his speech.